Welcome back. Your cigarette habits could be dangerous for children, according to a recent report by Human Rights Watch. And the report suggests that Indonesia, the world's fifth largest tobacco producer, has more than 500,000 farms, and almost all of the children working at this farm face hazardous consequences, and thousands of them aged as young as 8 years old work in dangerous conditions, and they harvest tobacco for products sold by multinational tobacco companies, including British American Tobacco, Philip Morris, and Gudang Garam. And many children also handle toxic chemicals, cut themselves with sharp tools, and strain their arms and backs lifting heavy loads.
As if they were actually exposed to.
And now to talk to us more about this growing concern is Margaret Wurth, researcher at Human Rights Watch. And thank you for being here, Margaret.
Thank you for having me.
So please, can you start with the most alarming condition that you found from your research?
What's most shocking about our research is that children are working on tobacco farms and they're exposed to nicotine and toxic pesticides. We interviewed 132 children. Half of those children reported suffering nausea, vomiting, headaches, and dizziness while they worked on tobacco farms. These are symptoms consistent with acute nicotine poisoning. Handling tobacco plants, workers can absorb nicotine through their skin. It can make them sick, and in the long term, it could have serious consequences for children.
But do they have to do it just because they're helping the families, for example? How's the condition of their economy back there?
Many children go to work in the fields to help their families who are struggling to make ends meet. We understand tobacco farming is an important livelihood for many families, but the parents that we interviewed are very committed to their children's future, to their well-being. The problem is no one had ever given them good information about the hazards of work in tobacco farming. We want to see the Indonesian government and the tobacco industry carry out a huge public education campaign so that tobacco farming families know this work could be hazardous for their children, and they find other ways for their children to contribute to the family without putting their health at risk farming tobacco.
Okay, before we criticize the government, how about the companies itself? Because I've read some facts from your article. Some of them actually responded well, but some of them didn't respond at all.
Tobacco companies have a responsibility to make sure there's not hazardous child labor in their supply chains. There are large Indonesian companies and big multinational companies purchasing tobacco from Indonesia, and none of these companies can guarantee that the tobacco they buy is child labor free. So that means the tobacco going into cigarettes sold in Indonesia and abroad to global consumers could contain tobacco that was produced by children who put their health at risk producing it. We shared our findings with a number of companies, multinational and Indonesian. None of the Indonesian companies responded to us with any meaningful response to our questions. And we couldn't find any evidence that these companies are taking any steps to prevent child labor in their supply chains.
That's based from the local companies. But how about the multinational? What did they do?
The multinational companies, most of them responded to us and shared some information about steps they take to address child labor in their supply chains. Many of them have policies prohibiting child labor, but their policies aren't strong enough. And the problem is most of these companies are not doing enough to monitor what's happening down at the level of the small farm where children could be risking their health working in tobacco farming. These companies need to know exactly where the tobacco they buy has come from so that they can guarantee that it wasn't produced with hazardous child labor. And the industry needs to do much more.
And do they communicate well with you, with the Human Rights Watch at the moment, especially for those who responded well to you?
For the last 3 years, we have engaged in meetings. We've met with several tobacco companies. We've exchanged correspondence. These multinational companies are providing more and more information to us about the steps they take in their global supply chains. We would urge the Indonesian companies to engage with us in a similar fashion so that we can understand the steps they are taking to make sure there's no child labor in their supply chains.
In terms of number now, especially for children, what kind of growth are we seeing here?
There are no official estimates of the number of children involved in work in tobacco farming in Indonesia. The International Labor Organization estimates about 1.5 million kids work in farming, but that includes all crops.
Oh, okay.
There are 500,000 tobacco farms in Indonesia, even more than that. So we estimate conservatively there are probably thousands of children working on these farms. It could be tens of thousands.
All right, then with that range of numbers, what kind of, you spoke with the families as well there, and how did they respond with your findings?
The truth is, most of these families, no one's ever explained to them in any detail the possible harmful effects of exposure to nicotine and pesticides among kids. Some families had some information about the dangers of pesticides, but even that information was inadequate. So I remember hearing from some children I interviewed, oh, if you don't drink the chemicals, they won't hurt you. When in fact, just mixing the chemicals, breathing in the fumes, being in the field when someone else is spraying, these are tasks that can expose children to these toxins that could have lasting effects on their brains and bodies. So we really want to see the government and the industry work hard to get this information to families so that Indonesian parents can protect their kids from danger.
Now let's move on to the government now. Have you speak with the government, especially with probably the health ministry or other ministries?
We met with the Ministry of Health earlier this week. We've also met with officials involved in child protection here in Indonesia, and we have a number of other meetings set up later in the week. What we want to see the Indonesian government do is carry out a big public education campaign to educate families. We also want to see them do much more to actually enforce labor laws here in Indonesia. The good news is Indonesia has laws prohibiting child labor that are aligned with international human rights standards. These laws need to be better enforced so that labor inspectors actually are getting out to the very small farms in rural, remote villages and seeing what's happening and making sure that children don't put their health at risk. We also want to see the Minister of Manpower and Transmigration issue a statement making clear that work handling tobacco is toxic because of the nicotine in the crop. And we hope he'll show leadership in doing this.
And since it's a classic issue for including children in a workplace like that, and how can we find a good solution for this? For example, if we compare this with other countries, what kind of policy that should be taken for the next couple of years?
Human Rights Watch has done research now in 3 of the world's top 5 tobacco producers, and it's interesting to compare Indonesia to Brazil. So Brazil is the world's 2nd largest tobacco producer. Indonesia is number 5. And like Indonesia, Brazil has many small farms that are run by families. The difference is, in 2008, the Brazilian government enacted a new regulation strictly banning all children under 18 from working in tobacco farming. They enforced this regulation, and the penalties for child labor apply not only to the farmer, but to the company that buys tobacco from that farm. So there's an incentive for the industry to make sure there's no child labor in their supply chains. The other thing the Brazilian government did, along with this child labor regulation, was a huge campaign to educate farming families about the risks of the work. And comparing Brazil to Indonesia, it was like night and day in terms of the awareness the farmers had of what the dangers could be for their children to do this work.
So what's your plan after this?
So we're going to continue to urge the Indonesian government and the industry to react. Publishing the report is just one step in this process, and we hope that this research will compel policymakers to make changes here in Indonesia and the tobacco company to do more to protect the children at the bottom of their supply chains.
Well, but are you optimistic enough to see the government's reaction from the last meeting?
We're very hopeful. You know, we think this example of what Brazil has done is a positive example for Indonesian authorities. And the good news about our findings is that most of the children attended school. Some didn't. Some had dropped out or skipped school during the harvest. But many of the children attended school, and their parents seemed very committed to their education, to their futures. This tells us that, you know, things may already be better than they might have been many years ago, and there are steps in the right direction in terms of child protection. Now we just have to make sure that in addition to keeping these kids in school, they're not doing any hazardous work when they're not in school.
And putting, you know, like a real action based on a very good policy. It's kind of hard work as well in this country. So if we compare to Brazil back again, how long can we see this work effectively based on your findings? Yeah.
Change isn't going to happen overnight, but you know, the tobacco farming season is going to be underway in the next few weeks. Farmers are going to be planting tobacco. Some of them have already started planting tobacco. And by August or September, children are going to be going out to the fields to harvest. They're going to be doing jobs where they're literally surrounded by tobacco leaves and exposed to this toxic nicotine. We're very hopeful that the government and the tobacco industry will take this research that we're publishing now and act swiftly to protect children from danger in the upcoming growing season in the next few months.
All right, Margaret, thank you for being here in the World Hour.
Thank you
so
for
much.
having me. It was nice meeting you.
Nice to meet you too. And coming up, Real Madrid continue their preparations for the UEFA Champions League and more from the world of sports. We'll be right back.